All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the mind of a psychologist who completely flipped our understanding of human behavior on its head, John B. Watson. Let's get right into it.
So, let me ask you something. Are we born with our fears, or are they taught? I mean, really think about it. That fear of spiders, or maybe speaking in public, where does that actually come from? Is it just baked into who we are, or is it something we picked up along the way?
Well, back in the early 20th century, one man, psychologist John B. Watson, came along and made a pretty bold claim. He said he didn't just think he had the answer, he was convinced he could prove it scientifically.
And his big proof? It wasn't just a single experiment. Nope. It was an entire school of thought that would basically take over psychology for decades. We're talking about his core idea, behaviorism.
Okay, so what is behaviorism exactly? Here's the key thing to get. It's all about what's observable. Watson basically said, look, we can't see thoughts, we can't see feelings or the unconscious mind. So if psychology is going to be a real science, like biology or chemistry, we have to study the stuff we can actually see and measure. And what's that? Behavior.
And you have to understand that this was a massive, massive shift. Before Watson, psychology was all about the mind. Psychologists were using methods like introspection, which is basically just thinking about your own thoughts. It's super subjective, right? Watson just came in and swept all that off the table. He was like, forget the unseen stuff. Let's focus on what's real, what's observable, what's scientific. Okay, so if we're only looking at behavior, how do we learn things? How does that even happen? Well, Watson had a pretty simple and powerful model for it. The stimulus response model, or the SR model. And this is the absolute heart of behaviorism. Watson's big idea was that we are all conditioned by our environment. He believed we're not really born with complex behaviors. We come into the world as a blank slate, and our environment, our experiences, they're what write our story. It all happens through this process he called conditioning. It's actually super simple when you break it down. First, you've got the stimulus. That's just a trigger in the environment. Anything, really. Let's say a hot stove. Then you have the response. That's the behavior you can see that follows. So you touch the hot stove, and you immediately pull your hand away. Stimulus, response. See? Simple, direct, and totally measurable.
So you can think of it like this. A bell rings. That's your stimulus. And then a little mouse jumps. That's the response. Watson believed that pretty much all human behavior, no matter how complicated it seems, could be boiled down to these simple little chains.
But hey, a theory is just a theory until you can prove it, right? And this is where things get really famous and honestly, pretty controversial. Watson set out to find his proof with what is now one of the most notorious studies in all of psychology, the Little Albert experiment. So what was he trying to prove? Watson wanted to push his theory to the limit. He asked a really fundamental question. Could an emotion, something as personal and internal as fear, just be another conditioned response? Could you teach someone to be afraid? So, the experiment started with this 9-month-old baby who they called Little Albert. And in phase 1, they showed him a fuzzy white rat. And what did Albert do? He was curious, maybe even happy. But one thing was clear, absolutely no fear. That was the baseline, super important. And then, phase 2, this is where the conditioning starts. Every single time little Albert reached for that white rat, one of Watson's assistants would sneak up behind him and smash a steel bar with a hammer. Just imagine that terrifyingly loud noise. Of course, the sound alone made Albert cry. It scared him. And they did this over and over and over again. The rat, then the loud noise.
So what was the result? Well, after pairing the rat and the noise enough times, all they had to do was show Albert the white rat. No loud noise, just the rat, and the poor kid would just burst into tears and try to crawl away as fast as he could. He had learned to fear the rat. The connection was made in his brain. And the implications of this? They were just staggering. For Watson and his followers, this was the ultimate proof. It showed that an emotion like fear wasn't some mysterious, deep-seated feeling. Nope. It was an observable, predictable response. It showed that fear could be conditioned into a human being, just like any other behavior.
Now, obviously, an experiment like that is completely and totally unthinkable by today's ethical standards. But back then, it cemented Watson's legacy, and it led him to make some of the most sweeping and, controversial claims ever made about who we are as people.
And that leads us to this quote. This is probably Watson's most famous and, frankly, most audacious claim. He said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select." And he wasn't kidding. He said he could make a doctor, a lawyer, an artist, or even a beggar or a thief.
I mean, just think about that for a second. This idea suggests that human nature is almost infinitely malleable. It's a huge vote for nurture over nature. What he's saying is that who we become has very little to do with our genes or our innate personality. It's almost all about our environment and what we've learned.
And that leaves us with a really challenging thought to end on. If Watson was right, even a little bit, it forces you to ask a pretty deep question about yourself. How much of you, your likes, your dislikes, your fears, your passions, is really you? And how much of it is just a product of a lifetime of conditioning?